Minister, you may be aware that next Saturday, April 28, is actually Workers' Memorial Day. And the figures that I've received this morning indicate that since 2008, we've had 216 deaths in the workplace. And we've seen a gradual increase year on year. I think in 2010 we had 48, we had 54 last year, and so far this year we've had 14 deaths. And when you consider that we're actually seeing a decrease in employment and an increase in the number of deaths in the workplace, it's something that this government needs to take on board and needs to tackle. There is no doubt, Minister, that there are some employers out there who are disregarding health and safety standards and procedures, and more often than not it's in the interest of chasing profits, and we're seeing the consequences of that. Now, I know in 2005 the Law Reform Commission did a report on the need for criminal liability in the area of corporate manslaughter. In 2007 we published our own bill, Sinn Féin published their own bill on this issue, and I know that the previous government before it fell in the last general election were looking at introducing legislation to address this area. I think that legislation, they actually published the heads of the bill in relation to it, and as part of that legislation they were looking at introducing two new offences, one around the area of corporate manslaughter, which would give effect to criminal liability against corporate entities, and the other was around management causing death, which would have held individuals responsible. And I'm just wondering, Minister, is this government going to pursue this legislation? Is it planning on bringing forward its own legislation to address this area? We're one of the few remaining countries within the EU which doesn't have legislation in this instance where people have lost their lives in the workplace as a result of the actions of their employers. And given the week that's in it, in the lead up to Workers' Memorial Day, I think it would be a good statement from this government to say that we are going to take on board the recommendations of the Law Reform Commission, and we are going to bring forward legislation to rectify this.
Deputy Ellis, 2 minutes.
Minister, the purpose behind Workers' Memorial Day is to remember the dead and fight for the living. A memorial to remember all those killed through work, but at the same time ensuring that such tragedies are not repeated. The best way to do this is to ensure better health and safety, but also stricter enforcement with higher penalties for breaches of health and safety laws in the workplace. Figures for workplace fatalities in the 26 counties are increasing, even though construction figures are at an all-time low, and we have a huge amount of unemployment. And it should be worrying for workers and their families, for trade unions, for employers and for the government that unsafe practices have increased in spite of the climate that's out there. So far this year, 14 people, according to the statistics. The need for more stringent health and safety regulations are long overdue. Sinn Féin has consistently argued the case for the urgent introduction of legislation that will put corporate killing on a statutory footing. When the figures are analysed, one has to ask why such legislation has not been introduced. It is not unreasonable to assume that some employers may take a cost-benefit approach to the implementation of health and safety requirements in the workplace. For example, it may cost more to arrange a safer traffic management system in the workplace or to replace damaged machinery than to pay the fine that would be imposed on the offending company should the death of an employee occur on the job. While this may seem a very cynical opinion of companies, it is not without warrant. It should not be the case that a company responsible for the death of a worker through its own negligence can argue that any fine imposed is unduly severe. It hardly acts as an incentive for companies to comply with the inadequate health and safety legislative requirements that currently exist. A system that allows reckless employers to get off scot-free for the death of an employee must not be allowed to continue. So possibly prosecution of individuals could be the key to reducing workplace deaths. There should be checks and balances, Minister, to ensure that all steps are taken as far as possible, and that includes safety equipment and signage are up to standard.
Thank you. Minister, 4 minutes.
Ceann Comhairle, I've been asked to address this matter in the House in the absence of my colleague, the Minister for Jobs, Enterprise and Innovation, Minister Bruton, who is abroad on government business at the moment. The health, safety and welfare of persons at work can be considered as a fundamental right for all workers, and as such it is governed by a comprehensive body of primary legislation. The responsibilities on employers and employees are clearly set out in the Safety, Health and Welfare at Work Act 2005. And these can be summarised as follows: the provision of a safe place of work by an employer, and the taking of reasonable care towards one's own safety and the safety of others while at work by each worker. The protection of workers in the workplace is recognised at all levels, from the United Nations by way of the work of the UN International Labour Organization, at an EU level through a multitude of occupational safety and health directives based upon the so-called Framework Directive in this area, and finally in our own domestic law. The Safety, Health and Welfare at Work Act 2005 updated and replaced the earlier 1989 Act under which the Health and Safety Authority was established. The authority supports the maintenance of a safe and healthy workplace for all our workers. Its functions under this Act include the promotion, fostering and encouragement of health and safety in the workplace, providing frameworks that support the prevention of accidents in the workplace, and the provision of education and training on health and safety in the workplace. The Health and Safety Authority has also responsibility to enforce the national provisions of occupational safety and health legislation, which it does this by inspecting, advising and, where necessary, prosecuting those in charge of a place of work for breaches of the legislation. The maximum penalties under the 2005 Act amount to €3 million and or 2 years imprisonment. And prosecutions have taken place at the behest of the authority where inspections or investigations have demanded this. Such prosecutions have generally centred on employers who have failed to ensure the provision of a safe environment for their employees, and where this failure has led to fatality. In this regard, it should be noted that under the Health, Safety and Welfare at Work Act 2005, managers and directors can be made liable and proceeded against directly for failures, and this has happened in a number of cases involving fatalities. Unfortunately, there has been workplace deaths for as long as there's been workplaces. To address these fatalities, and indeed the far too many injuries that can occur in workplaces, successive governments have introduced legislation to enable workers carry out their jobs in a safe way, in the safest way as possible. But over the last 5 years, including the early months of this year, 216 workplace deaths have been recorded by the HSA. Every single workplace fatality is a personal tragedy, a family tragedy, and a workplace tragedy that deeply affects many people. Over the course of that period, by far the worst affected areas have been agriculture and construction, representing 50% of the total. Each death is a terrible tragedy, and government continues to work in tandem with the Health and Safety Authority and the trade union, employer and farming bodies in particular to work towards even safer workplace environments. Overall, the Minister for Jobs, Enterprise and Innovation and the Health and Safety Authority are satisfied that current occupational health and safety legislation contains sufficiently robust provisions to deal with serious breaches by employers of their duty to provide a safe place of work for employees, or by employees behaving recklessly. Nonetheless, government and all players continue to work in partnership to continue to pursue ways and means of improving workplace safety on the ground. The Law Reform Commission report on corporate killing of 2005 recommended an offence of corporate manslaughter, as the deputies referred to, addressing corporate entities, and a derivative offence of grossly negligent management causing death, which could be addressed at high managerial agents within a company. Arising from this, a government decision of December 2010 approving the drafting by the Minister for Justice and Equality of a general scheme of criminal justice corporate manslaughter bill to implement the principal recommendations in the report. An interdepartmental working group chaired and by retired Secretary General of a government department, was established to conduct a regulatory impact assessment of these proposals. It is expected that the working group will complete the required RIA by the end of the year. Workers' Memorial Day is a day of remembrance for workers killed, injured or made ill by their work. In 2001, the International Labour Organization recognised Workers' Memorial Day and announced the 28th of April as the International Day of Action for Safety and Health at Work, which is an annual international campaign to promote health, safety and decent work around the globe. It is a memorial day that the government wishes to be associated with, and I understand the Health and Safety Authority will be involved in marking the day here in Ireland.
Thank you. Deputy O'Brien, 1 minute.
I'll be very brief. Minister, I don't agree with your analysis that the current legislation is robust enough. I mean, you spoke of the 2005 Act, and I would be interested, and I will get the answers through a PQ, in terms of how many people have actually been prosecuted under that Act, how many people have received the maximum penalty of 2 years imprisonment or a fine of €3 million. And I'm sure when I get those figures, you will see the difference in the number of people who have been brought to book compared to the number of deaths. In relation to the Law Reform Commission, you spoke of the impact analysis which has been done and hope to be completed at the end of the year. Minister, is it the intention of this government to introduce legislation to give effect to the Law Reform Commission's report, or will that be dependent on the impact analysis which is currently being undertaken?
Thank you. Deputy Ellis, 1 minute.
Just a small bit to add to that. I just think it's very disappointing that the Law Reform Commission report recommended in 2005 that there be an offence of corporate manslaughter, and that the government then in 2010 have this interdepartmental working group that has to come back as the report back. That is a very long time, and we really should be pressing. This is an urgent issue. In my own area of Dublin North West, we had under the regeneration of Ballymun, we had 2 fatalities, 1 worker and 1 child as a result of bad practices. So I just think the effects that this is having on families, we really need to move this as quickly as possible, Minister.
Thank you, Deputy. Minister, you have 2 minutes.
I want to congratulate both deputies for raising this matter. I suspect most people aren't aware that the 28th of April is this day to mark out in terms of better health and safety practices in the workplace. So I congratulate you, both of you, for raising this matter and highlighting it here in the floor of Parliament. You are absolutely right. There's a responsibility in government to respond to a long-standing report that came to a clear conclusion on the issue of corporate manslaughter. The government, in coming into office, gave a very clear commitment that where we're introducing new legislation, at the very least we would do a regulatory impact statement of the effects of that. And I understand from Minister Bruton that is now ongoing. There's an interdepartmental group working, and they expect to conclude at some stage over the next while. And I presume the conclusion of that will be one way or the other whether we want to legislate. So I'm not going to speculate what the outcome of that is, but I want to assure both deputies that the government are taking this issue very seriously, and we wouldn't have established an interdepartmental group were that not the case. Can I also say, I think it's very important to say that the extraordinary costs for the state associated with bad practice of work safety, and I'm referring here to the terrible, horrendous injuries that can be caused to workers in the cause of their duties, and then of course the state has to pick up the tab for that. So this is a much wider issue. It's not just about the appalling tragedy for families who lose loved ones during these terrible accidents. It's also about the enormous cost, the ongoing cost that the state has to bear because of those bad practices that should have been highlighted in the workplace in the first time. The deputy asked me how many prosecutions. I haven't got the figure, deputy, but I'll revert to you. I will revert to you, and I'll ask the Minister to revert to you as to the total number of prosecutions that have followed since the introduction of that legislation. I think it would be important to put that on the record.